Hey everybody, this is John W. Oddie, the author of Fail State, joining you once again to discuss the interaction between writing novels and video games. So strap on your ammo packs and lock and load, because this time we're going to talk about what first-person shooters can teach us about story immersion. Now, if you're not a gamer, you may wonder what first-person shooter means. Well, the genre is pretty self-explanatory. In these games, the player views the game world through the eyes of the main character, and they shoot stuff. Lots of stuff, with a wide variety of weapons. These are the games that are usually blamed after some national tragedy involving guns. Something that I've always thought was a little silly, but that's not neither here nor there right now. One of my favorite FPS franchises is the Dark Forces Jedi Knight games. In it, the gamer plays as Kyle Katarn, a mercenary who fights for the Rebel Alliance, only to discover that his father was really a Jedi, and that Kyle is Force-sensitive too. And he eventually becomes a Jedi Knight. Basically, I love these games because you get to play with a lightsaber. This is also one of the first gaming franchises that I got to share with my younger brother. For a while there, he would get the games before me, and then I would have to play catch-up. So he got Dark Forces first, he got Dark Forces Jedi Knight first, and so on and so forth. That all changed when Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast came out. I was able to buy it first, and so for once, I was able to drop hints about what my brother would experience when he played the game. Like how Luke Skywalker shows up, or how Lando Calrissian is in the game, and he's even voiced by Billy D. Williams. As a matter of fact, I remember one day I was able to tell him a story about something that happened to me while I was playing. I got to fight my way through Cloud City to the Carbonite Chamber where Luke and Darth Vader fought in Empire Strikes Back. And when I found it, I got to fight a Dark Jedi there as well. But here's the interesting thing. When I told him that story, I talked about it as if I were the one in Cloud City, or the one facing a fallen Jedi, with a lightsaber in my hand. Now, obviously, I wasn't actually in Cloud City. I'm not a Jedi in real life. At least I don't think I am. But I still talked like I was. And that's what I find fascinating. In most FPSes, the main character has a name and a backstory. For example, in the game BioShock, the main character is named Jack. He comes from a small farm, and then he crashes in the middle of the Atlantic and finds himself in a failed utopia filled with genetically modified freaks. In the Half-Life games, the main character is Gordon Freeman, an MIT-educated researcher who finds himself facing an invasion of creatures from another dimension. And yet, even though those are the characters' names, that's not how gamers talk about what happens in the games. It's not Kyle Katarn fought a Dark Jedi in Cloud City. It's I fought a Dark Jedi in Cloud City. It's not Jack made two Big Daddies fight each other. It's I made two Big Daddies fight each other. It's not Gordon Freeman took down a Combine Walker. It's I took down a Combine Walker. Now, obviously, I wasn't the one doing any of those things. Like I said, when I fought that Dark Jedi in Cloud City, I wasn't actually in Cloud City. Instead, I was seated in front of my computer in my comfy office chair. But that's the kind of experience that video game developers want to create for their players. They want them to be so immersed in the game world that they begin to see themselves as that game character. And really, that's the same kind of experience we as authors want to create for our readers, too. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A number of years ago, I was reading about how a woman went to an airport to catch a flight. And while she was there, she either purchased in the airport bookstore or she brought with her a Stephen King novel. And she intended to read the Stephen King novel while she was waiting for her plane. And so she started reading, and she really got into what she was reading, and she kept reading and reading and reading. And eventually, when she came up for air, she looked around in the gate and realized that there was nobody there. There were no other passengers. The flight attendants had all left. It was just her sitting by herself. And as she started to ask around, she came to the horrifying realization that she had missed her flight. She had been so engrossed by what she was reading that she completely spaced out on everything else that was going on around her, and she was left behind. Now, when I read about that story, I said to myself, you know, that is something that I want to be able to do someday. I want to be able to write a book that will get people just sucked in, and that was my ultimate goal. I knew it wasn't likely. I mean, I'm no Stephen King, but then this happened.
Hi there guys, it's Chris. I'm here today to review John Oddy's debut novel,
Fail State.
This book is being published by Marchalord Press, the premier publisher of Christian speculative fiction. It's their first foray into the realm of young adult literature, so John must be equally excited and terrified. Just kidding, this book will do great because it is great. I know about Fail State because I met John at my first writers' conference way back in 2010. See? Here's a picture of us. I'm the short one. Last year, because I'm cheap, I made John send me his novel for free, and I started reading it by myself at the airport waiting for my flight, which as it turns out was a bad idea. I ended up getting so absorbed in John's writing that the airport had to call my name twice over the speakers, which was really awkward, and then finally they got my attention, but my plane almost left without me.
Okay, so maybe it's not great to get excited about someone almost getting stranded in an airport, but that's still pretty cool. But isn't that the kind of reaction we want from readers? Don't we want that level of immersion in what we write? Creating an immersive story requires you to come up with an engaging plot, sympathetic characters, and building suspense on every page. None of which we're actually going to talk about in this video. No! Instead, we're going to look at 3 ways that FPSes create and maintain immersion, and how we can use those 3 things to help our stories. And those 3 things are, namely, the UI, simplification, and bug hunting. Let's start with UI, which is short for user interface. Simply put, the UI is something that the game designers construct so that the game can give the player relevant data that he or she needs to, play the game, while at the same time allowing the player to control the main character in the easiest way possible. In short, the UI is the filter between the player and the game world. You need something like this when you're playing a game. For example, when I'm playing the game BioShock, I'm not really in the underwater city of Rapture. Without a good UI, I wouldn't have any idea how much bodily damage I've taken or how much ammo I've used. Without a good UI, I wouldn't be able to control the character and get him to do what I want. One of the keys for a good UI is to not overwhelm the player. For example, this is a shot from BioShock. Notice that all they really give me is a red bar that tells me my health, a blue bar that tells me how much plasmid energy, a sort of genetic weapon, I have at my disposal, and how much ammo I have left for my gun. That's it. Now, they could have included a window that shows a miniature map, a list of goals, a tutorial section to remind me this is how I do the different tricks, but they don't do that. They just show me what I need to play this particular game. For example, the UI for the game Slender the 8 Pages is pretty minimal, mostly because there isn't a lot to the game. You don't need to keep track of ammo because you're unarmed. There's no map because they want you to feel like you're lost in the woods. And there's no health bar because you're either free or you've been caught by the Slender Man, and oh my gosh, there he is! Sorry about that. Moving on, here's another UI from the game Half-Life 2, and again you notice that it's pretty minimal. Down in the lower left-hand corner you have your health status. You also have the charge for the emergency suit that you're wearing, and over in the bottom right you can keep track of how much ammunition you have for your weapon. And this is Batman Arkham City. Again, you notice that it's pretty minimal. The game really only gives you a little bit of hint of what to do, like when to fire your grapnel hook, or what direction you're facing with the compass across the top of the screen, or when you're receiving a transmission from the spy gear that you have built into the cowl. The one thing that we should notice in all of these cases is that the UI does its best to stay out of the way and not overwhelm the player. That's the lesson that we as authors need to learn when it comes to our story, because in many ways, we are the UI for our stories. We are the filter through which the readers will see the story world. Let's face it, no matter how immersive my story may be, the readers are not actually in the world that I've created. They only see what I want them to see. They only interact with the characters the way that I want them to. And if I'm not careful about in how I do that, I can screw up the entire thing. Just like with a video game UI, it's probably best not to get too crazy, or else you'll just wind up distracting the reader. So, for example, don't show off your fancy vocabulary, especially if the word choices don't fit your character. Yes, it's great that you know what blandiloquent means. You probably don't want to send your readers heading for a dictionary unless you absolutely have to. Anything they encounter that makes them blink and reread a passage will damage the immersion. The same thing is true if your writing doesn't fit your character. Suppose you're writing the story of an uneducated young boy who never finished the 6th grade, but when he speaks, he suddenly sounds like an Oxford-educated senior citizen. That will create cognitive dissonance in your reader. Now, I'm not saying that you can't create a character who goes against type. If you create an uneducated yet intelligent character, that could work, but you have to be consistent in how you present him or her. For example, a number of years ago, I read a story in which there was a character who was supposed to be this high-class, hoity-toity British guy. But the strange thing is that the way he spoke and the way he acted changed from chapter to chapter. One minute he was very upper class, very put together, very educated. The next thing you knew, he was talking like an idiot. It just pulled me out of the story repeatedly every time that his voice changed. Now, that also applies to things that you might think would increase the immersion, like trying to write out accents. Now, I know a lot of people try to do that, but the problem is most of them don't do a very good job. And oftentimes the attempt only muddles what's happening in your story. Basically, the rule of thumb for an accent is don't, because you're probably not going to pull it off as well as you think that you will. There are exceptions, of course. Again, a number of years ago, I read a short story that was written from the perspective of a thug, a sidekick for a supervillain. And the author purposefully misspelled just about every single word in the story. And it worked. It worked beautifully, but for a couple of reasons. Number one, she was consistent in how she misspelled it. It was all sounding out the words the way somebody who doesn't understand English spelling might do it. And number two, the reason why it really worked, I think, is because it was short. I could do it for a short story, but if she had written an entire book that way, I would have stopped reading after maybe 50 pages. So basically what I'm saying is this: don't show off. Don't try to get too clever. It's best for an author to remain as transparent as possible and not draw too much attention to him or herself. If you try too hard to develop a unique voice, you're most likely going to overdo it and only distract the reader from what really matters, and that's your story. The next lesson we can learn from first-person shooter games has to do with their weapons and how simplified they are. Once again, let's visit the city of Rapture in BioShock. Toward the middle of the game, the player has collected every weapon, 8 of them to be specific. So you have the wrench, the revolver, the Tommy gun, the shotgun, the grenade launcher, a camera, don't ask, a chemical thrower, and a spear gun. Now, that's quite the arsenal you have at your disposal, and you have to find ammo for them. The reason why is because, like real weapons, the guns in the game will eventually run out of ammo if you shoot them for too long. As a matter of fact, the game will sometimes prompt you that you have to reload your gun because it's almost out. Now here's the thing that I find funny. I'm no expert when it comes to firearms. If you handed me all 8 of these weapons in real life, the only thing I'd know how to reload would be the camera because, well, I'm old. Somehow I doubt that my knowledge of how to thread film into a camera will transfer to knowing how to reload a pistol. And even if I knew how to do that, I doubt that that skill would transfer to reloading a grenade launcher or changing fuel tanks on a flamethrower. And yet, in video games, all of the different weaponry can usually be reloaded in the exact same way. When I play these games on my PC and my ammo is running low, all I have to do is hit the R key, and the character pops a full clip or tank or grenade or whatever into the weapon. No fuss, no muss, you're locked, loaded, and ready to go. What recently struck me odd about this, though, is how simple that whole procedure is. I mean, since I play on a PC, I have somewhere around 100 keys plus the mouse to control my character. If they wanted to, the developers could simulate the different reloading techniques for each weapon. For example, for the pistol, I could hit R, then J, right-click, and hit the space twice. Then for the shotgun, I could hit O, both shifts, pull the mouse toward me. But that's not what the developers do. They understand that slavish devotion to reality would make their games less fun. So they simplify. Just hit R, your guns are reloaded, and that's enough. Now, of course, the developers could also go too far in the other direction. They could decide to give the player unlimited ammunition so that he never runs out and never has to reload. But you don't see that happen because the developers know that gamers would get too frustrated at how unrealistic that is. The key for them is to strike the right balance between unlimited ammunition and too complex reloading procedures. They have to simplify and find the right balance. And that's a lesson that we should take to heart when we write as well, especially when it comes to 2 areas of our writing, namely stage directions and dialogue. How much detail do we really need to give when it comes to describing a character's day-to-day actions? For example, if I write a scene where my character has just woken up, do I have to go into the nitty-gritty of his entire morning routine? Will my readers be enraptured by the detail that he brushes his teeth before his shower and not after? Do I have to take them through every step of him cooking breakfast, eating it while reading the local paper, and then patting his dog on the head before heading out to work? Well, maybe, but probably not. If I spend page after page describing a character's morning routine, but knowing that information contributes nothing to the plot, it's just wasted words. But if that routine helps reveal something about the character's personality traits or flaws, then it might be worth including some of it. For example, maybe your character is borderline OCD, something you can show us by how he has everything in his life organized and how his routine is timed down to the last second. The other reason to go ahead and include a ton of stage directions is if those details somehow contribute to the plot and help move it forward. For example, maybe during the middle of the night the main character fell into an alternate reality. As he goes through his usual routine, he notices that things have changed slightly. His toothbrush has moved, his shower curtain has changed colors, he has a cat instead of a dog. One way to show us that something has changed is by establishing what the normal is. But even then, you have to ask yourself if what you're doing bogs down the story's flow too much. You have to be careful not to go too far in the opposite direction, though, and strip out too much detail. Now, I'm very guilty of this in my early drafts. I forget to put in enough details about how my characters are moving around or what they're doing. People who read my early drafts will leave me notes like, how did so-and-so get where he or she is right now? The key is finding the right balance between too much information and not enough. And that's not an easy thing to judge. It's a trial and error, learn as you go type of thing. The key, I think, is to ask yourself this question. Are the details that I'm putting into the story helping the plot move forward? Are they revealing information about my character? Or if you're like me, will my readers understand what my characters are doing, or am I asking them to fill in the blanks too much? The same principle is true when it comes to writing dialogue. Have you ever listened, and I mean really listened, to people having a conversation? Human verbal communication is a messy process. People don't engage in back and forth grammatically correct volleys like they do in books. They speak in incomplete sentences, vague phrases, they talk over each other, and a lot of stuff happens non-verbally. Truly replicating that in a book is next to impossible. So you have to simplify your dialogue. You have to make it that simpler, back and forth talking and grammatically correct and complete sentences. But at the same time, there's always that danger of making it too simplistic. We've all seen reviews of books where the reviewer complains about unrealistic wooden dialogue. That's something we want to avoid as well. So how do you make sure that your dialogue works? Well, I've got something you can do to see how it sounds. Read your dialogue out loud. If you're doing it by yourself, record yourself. Read it with as much inflection and emotion as you can muster, and even do voices if you want to. Or if you have some friends who are into theater, ask them to come and help you. Print out just the dialogue like it's a script. Give them the context of the scene and what each character wants, and then have them perform the scene and, once again, record it. Either way, you can now listen to people speaking your words, and you can ask yourself, does this sound real, or does it sound stilted and wooden? It'll help you zero in on where your dialogue is weakest and probably help you find ways to make it work better. The third thing that first-person shooters can teach us is about bugs. And I'm not talking about shooting giant insects either. No, I'm talking about programming bugs, glitches, mistakes, things that gamers hate. It happens every now and then. You're playing a game, not necessarily a first-person shooter, and all of a sudden something weird happens. Something that clearly shouldn't. And here are a few examples that I've collected. This is from Mass Effect 2. You notice how when something's moving there's like a ghostly after image here? This has happened every time I've played this game. Now these characters are not the Nyan Cat. This should not be happening. I'm going to apologize in advance if this next one creeps anybody out. This is from The Sims 3, and just watch. Yeah, needless to say, that should not be happening either. Now, usually these glitches are just superficial stuff that doesn't affect the gameplay too much, but sometimes a programming bug can be so severe that it causes a game to crash. If that happens once in a great while, most gamers will blow it off. Mistakes happen. But if it happens consistently with the same game or from the same developers, eventually gamers will give up and take their business elsewhere. Sadly, our writing can have bugs as well. Some of them will be small glitches like spelling or grammatical errors, but occasionally larger story killers will slip through. Let me give you 2 examples. Many years ago, I was reading a resource book about forensic science from a woman who was a crime scene technician. She had even been declared an expert in fingerprinting by a court in Georgia, if I remember correctly. So this is a lady who knows her stuff when it comes to crime scenes, sort of stuff like that. She talked about times where she actually spent hours with dead bodies because somebody had been murdered, that sort of a thing. In this book, she said that she was reading a crime novel one time when she came across something rather odd. The author was describing a murder victim and said that the victim's brains were a bright ruby red. Now, this crime scene tech knew better than that. People's brains aren't ruby red, they're gray. And so she started to wonder, why was this victim different? Did that person suffer from a rare medical condition? Had they been poisoned? Was this the side effect of some exotic toxin? She prepared herself for a twist like that, only that twist never came. She reached the end of the book and realized that the author of the mystery honestly thought that brains were ruby red. Years later, she met the author and asked her about it, and the author fessed up. She made a mistake. She figured that there was so much blood flow up here that brains would naturally be red. It was a bug, and it knocked the crime scene tech right out of the story. Now, I had a similar experience a few years back. See, I decided to try out a new author, a multi-published individual who was fairly popular in my circle of friends. I was excited because this guy had dozens of books that I figured I would soon be devouring if he was as good as my friend said he was. So I picked one at random and, read the back cover copy and said, wow, this sounds really good, and I started reading. Within the first 50 pages, I hit a bug, one that might have seemed minor and trivial, but it was so blatantly wrong that it bothered me. Now, I let it go and I kept reading, figuring, everybody makes a mistake every now and then. It was a weird mistake to make, and I was able to enjoy most of the book, but then about 2/3 of the way through, I hit an even bigger bug, one that was foundational to the whole story. It wrecked my enjoyment. I finished the book, but I haven't read any more of that author's work. Because of that bug, it was a story killer. So how do you avoid bugs in your writing? Well, the obvious way. You gotta do the work of rewriting. Don't let anybody ever see the first draft of your book. That is between you and God. In other words, you have to go through the book and find every spelling error you possibly can. You have to find every single bit of grammar that's wrong. You have to find any place where the point of view is just a little bit off. Any place that would set up that cognitive dissonance. Not only that, but you have to check your facts. Even if you're sure about something, it doesn't hurt to double check it just to make sure that you're right. There's that old adage, write what you know. Well, in this case, reverse it. Know what you write. Will bugs slip through? Of course, that happens. Nobody is perfect. You're not perfect. Your critique group partners aren't perfect. The editor you hopefully will work with someday isn't perfect. Things are going to slip through. But if you're diligent for them and willing to do the work, you can get rid of most of the bugs. And then people won't be distracted by them while they're reading. Now, hopefully these thoughts will help you create immersive stories for your readers. So I just want to say have fun and happy writing.